Psalm 22, verse 16. We've been focusing on how this psalm is, in many respects, a way of getting at the suffering and death of Jesus. It's used multiple times in the Gospels to describe not only his own words, but also the anguish he suffers through. This particular verse is really quite fascinating because it plays a big role in that, even though it's not directly cited. Moreover, one of the lines here is debated in terms of how there's a pretty meaningful difference between the Hebrew tradition and the Septuagint, so look forward to getting into some of that as well. Let's first read. Hati ekuklosan me, kunes paloi, synagoge paneruamenon, perieskan me, aruksan kerasmu ke padas. The hati here is going to point back to the prior few verses, building on this idea that the psalmist has really at the pit of despair physically and otherwise. He's breaking down. He's going to further explain why. So it's something like because ekuklosan. This is kuklao, third plural aorist active indicative. That means to encircle. Now, we've seen this before, actually, all the way back in verse 12. We saw that the bulls and the young cows of some sort were encircling the psalmist, so there's a bit of a thematic repetition, but there's a different animal now. It's the kunes, that's plural for dogs. Now, these are not going to be your designer doodles. These are going to be wild dogs of some sort, and there are many of them. So many wild dogs or something like that have encircled me. Then we have a synagogue, an assembly or gathering of paneruamenon. Now, this is from paneruamai. This is going to be a genitive plural masculine present middle participle. And this, you can probably tell based on the idea that paneros, the adjective, is really under the hood here. This is to do evil. So this is a synagogue, a gathering of evil doers or those doing evil. So it is substantival, but there's not an article in front of it. And what is this assembly of bad guys doing? They perieskan me. Again, we've seen that before. This is from periecho, third plural aorist active indicative. You just see the minor spelling change and the borrowing of the imperfect plural ending there. So an assembly of those doing evil has surrounded me, much like we saw in verse 12. Now, this is where things start to get quite fascinating. Here the verb is oruksan, which is from oruso. So you can see there's a square stops thing going on, an ending plus a lengthening on the front. This is a third plural aorist active indicative. Now, this word means to dig, to gouge, to pierce perhaps, and they have pierced my hands and feet. Hands here plus feet. Now, that's where it is really quite interesting because that sure does look and sound like crucifixion type language. However, whenever you look at the Hebrew, at least as we know it in the Masoretic text, things are not necessarily that straightforward. The Masoretic text has actually a word, k'are here, which is like a lion. The ka is like, and then are here, according to those consonants, would be lion. Now, that's a bit of a challenge because if that's true, then there is no verb, and basically the idea is like a lion, my hands and feet. So a lot of folks have said, well, what would that even mean? Is this the psalmist having some sort of broken syntax in the pit of despair and anguish? A lot of folks have debated that. Now, whenever we started discovering these scrolls around the Dead Sea, one of them from Nahal Hever, and that's a different place than Qumran, doesn't have k'are, it has k'aru. You have a third plural verbal ending there, and you could take that as they gouged. And so finally we have some evidence that maybe the Hebrew as we have it in the Masoretic text wasn't exactly quite right. Maybe it should be updated in some way. Maybe there's a different kind of Hebrew tradition. And again, it's just one letter, a yod versus a vav. Maybe that is what the Septuagint translator had in front of him to get at oruso here. Well, what do English translations do with this? Somewhat famously, the King James has, they pierced my hands and feet. Notice they don't say anything about the lion. Now, that's interesting because the King James, by and large, leans heavily in the direction of the Masoretic text, a particular version of the medieval text that they had at their disposal. Most of the times, they're going to land there. In this particular situation, most scholars would probably argue that it seems like they might be leaning in the direction of the Septuagint. And that's important because a lot of folks who are very pro-KJV or pro-Masoretic text, and I am too, by the way, and I love the King James, they want to hold the line and say they never do this, or at least they try to somehow figure out a way to get around this. It's very difficult to do because there weren't really any other medieval texts that they would have had that read something different. Maybe they themselves were changing the Hebrew or amending it some way, so that's kind of a flashpoint in the debate. What do modern translations do? The ESV plus NIV, CSB, NASB, and so forth, they essentially follow suit with the King James with they pierced. The Net Bible kind of splits the difference. They still leave in the like a lion. They've got the hands and the feet, but they kind of cheat and they put a verb in there that's not there, maybe trying to blend the Masoretic with this verb from the Septuagint. I think that's what they're doing. They have a long note there that's quite helpful getting into some of the debate. Well, what about Calvin? Calvin actually comments on this in his commentary on the Psalms, which is really interesting because, of course, this takes us back to just the subsequent decades after the King James and so forth, kind of getting us into what was happening back then. And he says this: the original word, which we have translated "they have pierced," is chare. Now, that's exactly what I showed you on the screen, which he says literally rendered is like a lion. So why doesn't he go with that? Well, here's his opinion. As all the Hebrew Bibles at this day, without exception, so from Calvin's perspective, there are no medieval Hebrew manuscripts in his day that had anything else. They all have the lion reading. So he says, because of that, I would have great hesitation in departing from it, because they all support it. He's like, I don't do this lightly, but the scope of the discourse, and what I think he means by that is that it just seems like this verse here is pointing to a crucifixion. That seems to be the idea. And we already have good grounds to sort of vet that out because Psalm 22 has been used a lot in the gospel passion narratives. It compels me to do so. And there are strong grounds for conjecturing. So yes, he is going to make a conjectural emendation that this passage has been fraudulently corrupted by the Jews. So he thinks those who are editing the Masoretic text are the ones who introduced the error. So therefore, he says, well, let's go with Septuagint, because there's no doubt the translators had read in their Hebrew, which was later corrupted in the Masoretic text, Aru. Now, that hypothesis is really quite fascinating because there was no evidence for it in his day other than the Septuagint, but we see some evidence there from the Dead Sea area. So really interesting stuff, what Calvin does here. He's not alone in this, at least sort of being honest that, hey, maybe we go against the Hebrew as it's been passed down and go with the Septuagint. In other words, to use the Septuagint to edit the Hebrew. So very interesting stuff. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And it's been a long video, but thanks for tuning in.